As I got ready for the sermon this week, as I sat with the exegesis, one of the writers of the commentary I was reading invited me to think about where Jesus had shown up in my life over this past week, and whether having seen him or having failed to see him made a difference. And I had to sit with that question for a minute. And the first place I landed, though it wasn't the place that I ultimately stopped, was I thought about the things I was grateful for over the past week. And I wrote them all down. And then I was like, well, how do I understand these? Did Jesus send these blessings my way? Are they just the part of everyday life? What's the line of causality here? I just don't know. And I thought about how early in the week last week, my boys got strep on Monday. And I thought about how I thought that the week was going to explode, right? That there would be no Thanksgiving, that it would just be strep and fevers the whole week long. But we got to urgent care right away. We got antibiotics right away. And so not only did they make Thanksgiving, but they made the class party on Wednesday. And as I thought about that blessing, I was like, well, who do I thank? Do I give thanks to Jesus for entering in? Or do I give thanks to modern medicine that's created antibiotics? And that, I think, is like kind of the whole question, right? The whole question of staying awake. Are we going to keep our eyes open to the possibility that God might be working in our midst? Or will we fall asleep and miss them? Around this time last year, I read an article in the New York Times that talked about faith-healing miracles that were happening in Thailand, and how sometimes someone would be prayed over and they would be in the hospital, right, under medical care, and someone would come in and pray over them, and how they were raised to new life. They practically came back from the dead. And how that healing, would become central to that family's faith story. And then the article went on to say, we here in the West and in the United States, many of us struggle to believe in those kinds of miracles. We write them off as a placebo effect, or that there was natural causes that we couldn't quite see, or sometimes we think those stories are an out-and-out lie. And it led me to wonder if perhaps sometimes miracles are happening, but we are failing to see them because we are asleep to ourselves and asleep to the possibility that God might indeed enter in. We know so much these days about the world around us, and that is such a good gift. It's given us things like antibiotics, and it's given us things like vaccines, and it's given us things like the ability to predict the path of a hurricane with pretty good accuracy, which allows us to be safe and prepared. But as we understand the world and our scientific knowledge seems to grow, our capacity for wonder, for a belief in mystery, seems to diminish. Sometimes we, even people of faith, we fail to believe in a God who could act, a God who enters into our struggles, a God who might choose to tip the scales in the direction of justice and righteousness. We've trained our eyes to see the world in a certain way, and that's given us so many good gifts. But it leaves us vulnerable when the ground beneath our feet feels uncertain. I worry that when we fail to look for God in small things, like boys getting access to antibiotics, it then gets harder to look for God in the big things. This passage from Mark, it's weird, right? Let's just call it as it is. It is weird. It uses language and images that we don't understand, and that's scary maybe, and even off-putting. But it's pointing us in the direction of something hopeful. It's pointing us in the direction of a God who does act, a God who enters in, a God who isn't afraid to get God's hands dirty and to hold us together when it feels like everything is falling apart. So let's sit with this God today. Let's unpack these symbols and talk about what they mean so that we can experience a God who meets us in our breakdowns and can carry us through to a breakthrough. To understand this passage, it's helpful to know the context into what Mark is speaking, both the literary context and the historical. At the beginning of this chapter, the disciples are marveling at the temple. It is massive. It is this beautiful work of art and architecture, and its stones are huge. And it seemed like it could never fail, that it might never crumble. But Jesus knows, and Mark knows, that within 35 years, Rome is going to lay siege to Jerusalem. That for 5 months, the Roman armies will camp outside Jerusalem's walls, that people are going to starve, and that eventually Rome will break through and it will take down the temple. That is the context in which Mark is writing his gospel. He's speaking to a people who are watching their religious symbols crumble to pieces at their feet. He's speaking to a people who are watching life as they know it fall apart. And Mark needs them to know that even here, Jesus is present. Even here, at the end of the world as we know it, God is at work. And so he uses this literary genre that we don't really use so much anymore. It's called apocalyptic literature. And that's where writers talk about the sun going out and the moon failing to give light and the stars falling from the sky and the planets being shaken and the earth being shaken to its core, to talk about how God can enter in and God can set things to right, and God takes us through our present crisis to a place of more solid ground. These images, whether you understand them literally or whether you understand them metaphorically, are meant to point us in the direction of God's power. They're pointing us in the direction of an apocalyptic revelation. Apocalypse just means revelation. It's a glimpse of action. What Mark is saying is that God is going to enter in and turn the world upside down. It's not the end of the world, it's the end of the world as you know it. And that's a powerful, good word to a people who are starving, to a people who are thirsty, to a people who have no access to the basic necessities of life. Mark is saying, even here, God's power is at work. Even here, your situation is not your destination. Jesus is here, and he will change the world radically for the better. They can have hope even in the face of their current destruction, because this isn't the end of the story. Jesus is saying, I see where you are, and I'm going to take you somewhere else. The story isn't finished. Your story isn't finished. If God wanted to give me an apocalyptic revelation of God's action on Monday night, it might have been something like, Sarah, you're in sickness right now. Everybody's got fevers. Everybody is crying. But there is wholeness that's coming by Wednesday. You are in sickness, but you're going to get to wholeness, and sooner than you might think. If we think about Jesus entering into the crisis of Gaza, even as early as last week, we might say that there's destruction now. There is pain now, but a ceasefire is coming, and hostages and prisoners will be exchanged and will head back home. It seemed like an impossibility even 10 days ago, but now it is a reality because God enters in. God carries us someplace different. God enters in and carries us from broken ground to solid ground. And it doesn't make it better right away. It doesn't diminish or erase the pain of where we stand right now. My husband and I were talking, more than 14,000 women and children have died in Gaza. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't diminish that pain or that loss. But a belief in a God who acts, a belief in a God that could indeed make the sun dark and make the planets shake. It provides real hope, realistic hope, hope that animates our spirits enough to act, to take our place in the story, and to respond when and as we can. That's what it looks like to keep awake, to keep our eyes open to the fact that in every situation, whether it's joyful or whether it's sorrowful, that God could enter in and do something real. And it's not possible to be that kind of hopeful all the time. But I don't think that we have to keep awake by ourselves. When I was in seminary, the president taught a class on pastoral care, and he told a story about how sometimes people in his congregation would argue with him about saying the Apostles' Creed is the basic creed of our faith. And he would say, like, Pastor, I don't believe that creed, so I don't feel like I can say it. And what he used to say to them was, it's not your creed. It's the church's creed. And together, the church has enough faith for you to say it with integrity, even if you're wrestling with doubt that day. And that stuck with me. I think it's the same with keeping awake, with believing in the possibility of God's action, but holding on to a hopeful expectancy that Jesus might enter in. Like, we can't do it by ourselves. I can't be that hopeful all the time. Maybe sometimes I can do it for you, but I can't do it for me. We don't have to stay awake the whole night long. If you're camping outside and you are afraid of wolves, they keep a watch. You stay awake for 2 hours, your friend stays awake for 2 hours, your cousin stays awake for 2 hours, and together you make it through the night. Keeping awake is about holding on to hope for each other when we can't hold it for ourselves. I have a silly example of this. Earlier in the summer, I was hoping to get the boys into like a new school, and they're 6 and they're 3, and they're just in like a potty mouth phase, which is awful. And so they had to go and meet their teachers, right? And I was like, please, dear Lord, let them be well behaved. Just please, dear Lord, I need them to be in the same school for the same amount of time so that I can do work. Please, God. And I told Khalil all this, and I was like, Khalil, I don't know that they're going to get in. And he was like, we're going to proclaim it, Pastor. I don't remember what you said, Khalil, but you're like, we're going to hold it. I believe that it's real for you, that they're going to get into this school. He held hope for me, right, when I didn't have hope for myself, and it made a difference. I felt comforted in the moment, and then they did both manage to get into the same daycare school, thanks be to God. But he held hope when I just didn't have much, and it made a difference. It made a difference, right? That's what's so beautiful about this beloved community. We can hold hope for each other. We can believe that Jesus is up to something in our lives for each other. And we can watch and we can wait and we can keep awake for each other, holding space for one another for the possibility of miracles. That's the invitation, I think. Can we keep awake? Can we open our eyes? Can we believe not just intellectually in our brains that maybe it might be true, but in our bodies and in our spirits that Jesus sees our suffering, that Jesus enters into that suffering, and that Jesus can and will act decisively to carry us through that suffering to a better place? This text, it invites us into a hopeful anticipation for what God can do when it feels like everything is falling apart. Together, let's keep awake. Let's open our eyes Together, let us look for Jesus at work in our midst, whether that's gratitude or whether that's something else. And then let's tell that story of the time that we saw God move, that we might keep each other awake, and that we might continue to awaken hope for ourselves and hope for a world that desperately needs it. Jesus, help us to see you. And when we see you, help us to tell the story so that we might be encouraged and that we might be hope for one another.